November 1943, Bougainville Island. While command debated firepower doctrine in air-conditioned tents, Private First Class Tony Castillo from San Antonio, Texas, stood at the edge of a defensive perimeter, holding a weapon his superiors called impractical. In 15 minutes, he would rewrite Marine Corps tactical manuals and save an entire company from annihilation. What they dismissed as too heavy, too slow, too cumbersome, became the difference between survival and massacre. The pre-dawn darkness of November 7, 1943, clung to the muddy defensive line at Piva Trail, Bougainville Island. At 0445 hours, the temperature sat at 78 degrees Fahrenheit, but the humidity made every breath feel like drowning. Private First Class Tony Castillo, 22 years old, born and raised in the stockyards of San Antonio, crouched in a fighting hole that smelled of rotting vegetation and salt water. His M19-19A4 Browning machine gun sat mounted on its tripod before him, 41 pounds of steel that his platoon sergeant, Gunnery Sergeant Harris from rural Georgia, had called a goddamn boat anchor. The statistical reality was undeniable. Since landing on Bougainville 3 weeks earlier, 3rd Marine Division had sustained 728 casualties. Japanese infiltration tactics were devastating American defensive positions with alarming efficiency. Night attacks came in waves, small disciplined units that slipped through perimeters designed for conventional assaults. The standard defensive doctrine relied on the M1 Garand rifle, 8 rounds of semi-automatic fire per soldier. Doctrine stated machine guns belonged in fixed positions far behind the line, providing suppressive fire during planned engagements. Forward positions were for riflemen. That was the rule. Tony Castillo had broken that rule. 3 days earlier, after watching Japanese soldiers overrun a neighboring company's position, killing 17 Marines in under 10 minutes, he'd made a decision that contradicted every tactical manual issued at Camp Pendleton. He dragged his Browning forward from the company CP and positioned it in his fighting hole on the extreme left flank of the defensive perimeter. The weapon weighed more than a wounded man. The tripod alone was 14 pounds, 500 rounds of linked .30-06 ammunition in metal cans added another 35 pounds. Moving it required determination bordering on obsession. Gunnery Sergeant Harris had confronted him at 1600 hours that afternoon, standing over the fighting hole with arms crossed, jaw tight with institutional frustration. Castillo, what the hell are you thinking? That weapon belongs at the CP. You're exposed here. You can't displace if they flank you. You'll be overrun in the first 30 seconds of contact. Tony had looked up from cleaning the weapon's feed tray, hands black with carbon residue and gun oil. Sergeant, with respect, the CP is 200 yards back. By the time we call for support and they set up, half the platoon is dead. I saw what happened to Dog Company. They needed immediate suppressive fire. They didn't have it. The manual says... The manual was written by officers who've never held a perimeter at night in this jungle, Sergeant. Tony's voice remained steady, respectful but unyielding. I'm not questioning their intelligence. I'm questioning whether their doctrine accounts for an enemy that doesn't fight the way we expected. Harris had stared at him for a long moment. The bureaucratic instinct warred with combat pragmatism. Finally, he'd said, "If you get yourself killed because you can't move that boat anchor fast enough, I'm putting it in your after-action report." He'd walked away without ordering Tony to move the weapon back. That conversation replayed in Tony's mind as he sat in the darkness, hands resting on the Browning's spade grips. The weapon was an anachronism in modern Marine doctrine, a relic of World War I trench warfare. But Tony had grown up in his uncle's machine shop, had understood mechanical systems since he could walk. He knew this weapon's capability. Rate of fire, 400 to 600 rounds per minute. Effective range, 500 yards. Sustained fire capability, limited only by ammunition and barrel temperature. In the right hands, positioned correctly, it could create an impenetrable wall of steel. The official Marine Corps position remained clear. Machine guns were support weapons, not frontline defensive tools. They required crew-served operation, gunner, assistant gunner, ammunition bearer. Forward positions needed mobility and flexibility. A 41-pound weapon violated those principles. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, a West Point graduate from Connecticut who'd earned his commission in peacetime, had explicitly stated in a briefing 2 weeks earlier, "Gentlemen, the individual rifleman is the foundation of Marine infantry doctrine. Support weapons provide auxiliary firepower. Do not confuse the two." But Tony had watched 17 Marines die while waiting for auxiliary firepower. He'd watched Japanese soldiers armed with Nambu light machine guns and Type 38 rifles exploit the 15-second reload time of American M1 Garands. He'd watched enemy infiltrators move through darkness with discipline that spoke of training and doctrine far more adapted to jungle warfare than American forces possessed. The institutional answer was maintain position and call for support. The practical answer was die waiting for help that arrives too late. The first indication came at 0512 hours. A single rifle shot, distant, perhaps 400 yards into the jungle. Then silence. Tony's hands tightened on the grips. Corporal Jensen, sharing the fighting hole, whispered, "Think that's them?" "That's them," Tony replied. "Get ready." The Japanese tactical approach on Bougainville followed a pattern intelligence had documented, but doctrine hadn't adequately addressed. Reconnaissance by fire, a single shot to gauge response. Then silence, waiting to see if defenders revealed positions by shooting at shadows. If Americans opened fire blindly, muzzle flashes identified every fighting hole. If they remained silent, infiltrators crept closer. It was a psychological trap. The only winning move was to wait within human discipline until targets became visible. Tony had made his decision 3 days ago. He would wait. When contact came, he would prove that one soldier with the right weapon, in the right position, could accomplish what an entire platoon of riflemen could not. He would prove that doctrine written in classrooms sometimes failed when tested by reality. He would prove that American know-how, the pragmatic, innovative spirit that built Detroit's factories and California's shipyards, could adapt faster than military bureaucracy. At 0520 hours, the jungle exploded with sound. Not the gradual build-up of a conventional attack, but instantaneous chaos. Type 89 grenade discharges, knee mortars, began dropping 50mm rounds into the perimeter. Nambu machine guns opened fire from 3 directions, and through the explosions and muzzle flashes came the screaming, "Banzai, Banzai, Banzai!" The massed infantry assault, dozens of Japanese soldiers charging through darkness with fixed bayonets, betting everything on shock and momentum. Tony's world contracted to the Browning's sights, the charging shadows 40 yards away, becoming distinct human shapes at 35 yards. His finger found the trigger. Institutional doctrine said this weapon belonged 200 yards behind him. Combat reality said it belonged exactly where it was. The question of who was right would be answered in the next 15 minutes. If doctrine prevailed, Tony Castillo would die, proving a point. If pragmatism prevailed, 60 Japanese soldiers were about to learn that American innovation didn't wait for permission from officers in air-conditioned tents. The Browning M19-919A4 roared to life at 0521 hours, and the sound was unlike anything Corporal Jensen had experienced in 5 months of combat. Not the sharp crack of M1 Garands or the staccato bursts of Thompson submachine guns, but a sustained mechanical thunder that seemed to shake the ground itself. Tony Castillo's hands guided the weapon with movements that spoke of countless hours of practice, traversing left to right across the assault wave, firing in 6 to 9 round bursts that ripped through the pre-dawn darkness with devastating precision. The first burst caught 3 Japanese soldiers at 30 yards, dropping them instantly. Tony adjusted right, fired again, caught 2 more. The linked 30-6 ammunition fed through the weapon with mechanical reliability that justified every hour Tony had spent maintaining it. Feed tray polished smooth, every round inspected for corrosion, belt links checked for damage. In the factories of Detroit and Springfield, Massachusetts, American industrial workers had manufactured this ammunition to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Now, 7,000 miles from home, that precision translated to lethality. The Japanese assault wave, numbering perhaps 80 soldiers from the 23rd Infantry Regiment, had expected scattered rifle fire from individual fighting holes. Their tactical doctrine, refined through years of fighting in China and Manchuria, relied on overwhelming, isolated positions before defenders could coordinate response. They had not expected a single machine gun positioned at the exact point of their main effort, delivering sustained fire that created an impassable kill zone. Tony's fighting hole occupied the left flank of 2nd Platoon's defensive sector, adjacent to a narrow trail the Japanese were using as an avenue of approach. Intelligence had noted the trail in reconnaissance reports, but assessed it as unlikely route of advance due to exposure. The Japanese had read the same terrain differently, a covered approach through thick jungle vegetation that would allow them to concentrate force against what they presumed was a weak point in American lines. They were correct about everything except the presumption. "Reloading!" Tony shouted above the gunfire. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, lifting the feed tray cover, removing the empty belt, threading a new 250-round belt through the feed mechanism. Elapsed time, 11 seconds. During those 11 seconds, Corporal Jensen and the Marines in adjacent fighting holes poured rifle fire into the darkness, maintaining pressure. But the difference was stark. 6 Marines with M1 Garands could deliver perhaps 40 aimed shots in 11 seconds. Tony's Browning had fired 180 rounds in the previous 32 seconds. The mathematical reality was inescapable. A rifle platoon armed with standard weapons could generate approximately 240 rounds per minute of aimed fire across 40 Marines. Tony's single machine gun, properly employed, generated 450 rounds per minute. And unlike riflemen who had to acquire individual targets, aim, fire, and reacquire, the machine gun's sustained traverse created a beaten zone, an area where every square foot received multiple impacts. The tactical effect wasn't addition, it was multiplication. The physical toll was immediate and brutal. The Browning's barrel temperature climbed rapidly. Tony could feel heat radiating through the weapon's housing. His hands ached from controlling the recoil, arms straining to maintain the tripod's stability against soil, softened by 3 weeks of intermittent rain. The M19 919A4 weighed 41 pounds, but sustained fire made it feel like twice that. His shoulders burned. His fingers cramped around the spade grips. The constant muzzle blast created pressure waves that pounded his chest with each burst. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop. Because 30 yards in front of his position, Japanese soldiers were paying the price for their commander's doctrine. Bodies littered the kill zone. The wounded cried out in Japanese, voices high and desperate. The assault wave faltered. Soldiers seeking cover behind fallen logs and shell craters, no longer advancing in coordinated rushes, but pinned down by firepower they couldn't suppress. At Vive 24 hours, a Japanese Nambu Type 96 machine gun opened fire from Tony's right, attempting to suppress his position. The 6.5mm rounds snapped through the air inches overhead, forcing Tony to hunker down behind the Browning's thin gun shield. Corporal Jensen immediately understood the tactical situation. If that Nambu wasn't silenced, Tony couldn't maintain fire, and the assault would resume. "I see him," Jensen shouted, pointing toward a muzzle flash 60 yards distant. "Tree line, 12 o'clock!" Tony made a decision that violated every principle of crew-served weapons employment. He grabbed the Browning's traversing and elevating mechanism, unlocked it, and manually traversed the entire weapon 45 degrees right. The tripod groaned under the torque. He elevated slightly, acquiring the distant muzzle flash through his sights, and pressed the trigger. The Browning's 30.06 rounds, significantly more powerful than the Nambu's 6. Vermitatus ammunition ripped through jungle vegetation and found their target. The enemy machine gun fell silent. "Jesus Christ," Jensen breathed. "They didn't teach us that at Camp Pendleton." "They didn't teach a lot of things," Tony replied, traversing back to his original sector. His hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from physical exhaustion and adrenaline overload. How long had it been? 4 minutes? 5? Time had become elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. But the belt can beside him was nearly empty. He'd fired perhaps 400 rounds. That meant the second assault wave hit at Osei in 26 hours. Fresh Japanese soldiers, moving through the carnage of the first wave, screaming "Banzai," with voices that mixed desperation and fury. They'd seen their comrades cut down. They knew death waited in that kill zone, but their doctrine demanded assault. Retreat meant dishonor. So they charged into the Browning's sights. And Tony Castillo, son of Mexican immigrants who'd worked 16-hour shifts in San Antonio's meatpacking plants, proved that American determination, measured in sustained trigger pulls, could break any assault. The barrel was glowing now, visible even in darkness, a dull red that spoke of temperatures exceeding 600 degrees Fahrenheit. The weapons manual warned against sustained fire beyond 150 rounds without barrel changes. Tony had fired nearly 600 rounds. The Browning's mechanism continued cycling with mechanical precision that testified to American manufacturing excellence, but physics couldn't be denied. The barrel was approaching failure temperature. "Tony, you gotta let it cool," Jensen shouted. "Can't." Tony fired another burst, caught 2 soldiers climbing over a fallen log. "If I stop, they break through." This was the moment battalion doctrine said couldn't happen. A single soldier armed with a weapon his superiors called impractical, holding a defensive sector that should have required an entire squad, fighting through physical exhaustion and equipment limitations that training manuals said made sustained employment impossible. But doctrine was written for ideal conditions. Combat created conditions that defied ideals. And Tony Castillo, who'd learned mechanical systems in his uncle's machine shop and understood that sometimes you pushed equipment beyond specifications because the alternative was failure, kept his finger on that trigger and proved that American pragmatism beats institutional hesitation every single time. At 05:33 hours, 12 minutes after the first shot, the Japanese assault broke. The survivors, perhaps 20 soldiers from the original 80, fell back into the jungle, dragging wounded when possible, leaving dead behind. The kill zone before Tony's position held approximately 60 bodies, most within a 40-yard radius of his fighting hole. 60 casualties inflicted by one soldier with one weapon in 15 minutes. Tony released the trigger. His hands were cramping so badly he could barely open his fingers. The Browning's barrel hissed and popped as it began cooling. Cordite smoke hung in the air, thick and acrid. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that would last for hours. But 2nd Platoon's defensive line held intact. 0 American casualties. Gunnery Sergeant Harris arrived at the fighting hole at 05:45 hours, moving through the position, checking Marines and assessing damage. He stood at the edge of Tony's hole, staring at the Browning, at the empty ammunition cans, at the bodies visible in the growing dawn light. He didn't speak for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Castillo, you might just have saved the entire company." He paused. "And you definitely proved me wrong about that boat anchor." At 07:30 hours, as morning light fully illuminated the battlefield, Captain Takeshi Yamamoto of the Japanese 23rd Infantry Regiment crouched in a concealed observation post 800 yards from the American defensive perimeter. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the cognitive dissonance of observing an outcome his training and doctrine said couldn't exist. Through German-manufactured binoculars, he studied the kill zone, where 62 of his soldiers lay dead or dying, victims of firepower that contradicted everything he'd learned at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy. The tactical briefing from regiment headquarters had been explicit. American Marine defensive positions relied on individual riflemen armed with the M1 Garand, an 8-round semi-automatic weapon with superior fire rate but limited tactical depth. Japanese doctrine countered this with massed infantry assault, overwhelming individual positions before Americans could coordinate supporting fires. The mathematics favored the attacker. 80 Japanese soldiers against approximately 40 Marines in the target sector. Standard engagement doctrine predicted 40–60% casualties among Japanese forces, but assured breakthrough within 10 minutes, after which hand-to-hand combat and superior Japanese martial spirit would carry the position. Instead, Captain Yamamoto had watched his assault waves shattered by sustained automatic weapons fire from a single point in the American line. The fire discipline was extraordinary. Controlled bursts, not the panicked spraying typical of American machine gunners. The weapon's position contradicted American tactical doctrine, as Yamamoto understood it. Machine guns belonged in rear positions providing supporting fire, not forward, in defensive fighting holes where they became priority targets for Japanese grenade dischargers and infiltrators. Lieutenant Koji Tanaka, executive officer of 2nd Company, crawled beside Yamamoto. His face was pale, eyes reflecting the trauma of watching 2 platoons destroyed in 15 minutes. Captain, I don't understand what happened. Our intelligence was clear. The Americans don't employ crew-served weapons in forward positions. It violates their doctrine. Doctrine, Yamamoto repeated bitterly. The word tasted like ashes. His military education at Tokyo's most prestigious academy had emphasized the superiority of Japanese tactical thinking, rigid discipline, unquestioning obedience, spiritual strength over material advantage. The Americans, by contrast, were portrayed as soft, individualistic, lacking the collective will for sustained combat. Their material advantages couldn't compensate for spiritual weakness. Except that a single American soldier had just demonstrated firepower discipline that destroyed 2 veteran infantry platoons. And more troubling, the weapon itself was positioned in violation of American doctrine, which meant either their intelligence about American tactical employment was catastrophically wrong, or individual American soldiers were adapting doctrine in the field faster than Japanese command could adjust. Through binoculars, Yamamoto studied the fighting hole that had anchored the American defense. He could see Marines moving around it, the distinctive shape of a Browning M1919A4 on its tripod, ammunition cans being carried forward. The weapon itself was visible, barrel still cooling, positioned at an angle that provided interlocking fire across the exact approach route Japanese planners had selected as optimal. They knew, Lieutenant Tanaka whispered. Captain, they positioned that weapon specifically to counter our assault route. No, Yamamoto replied slowly, mind working through tactical implications. They didn't know our specific plan. That weapon's position covers multiple approach routes. What they did was more dangerous than foreknowledge. They thought independently. They saw terrain we considered advantageous and understood it made us predictable. They positioned firepower to exploit our own doctrine against us. Oh, this was the nightmare scenario Imperial headquarters refused to acknowledge. That American military culture, with its emphasis on individual initiative and mechanical aptitude, could adapt faster than Japanese rigid hierarchical structure could respond. The official position from Tokyo was clear. American industrial capacity was formidable, but American soldiers lacked fighting spirit. Material advantage couldn't compensate for spiritual weakness. The war would be won through superior Japanese willpower and tactical discipline, but willpower didn't stop. 30-06 armor-piercing rounds fired at 2,800 feet per second. Tactical discipline didn't matter when assault waves entered a kill zone that delivered 450 rounds per minute of sustained fire. and spiritual strength was no consolation to the 62 bodies cooling in the jungle mud. At 08:15 hours, Major Hiroshi Sato, regimental intelligence officer, arrived at the observation post. His presence signaled command-level concern about the engagement's outcome. He studied the battlefield through his own binoculars before speaking. "Captain Yamamoto, I need your assessment for regimental commander. How did this happen?" Yamamoto chose his words carefully. Criticism of doctrine could be interpreted as defeatism, but lying about tactical reality would guarantee future failures. "Sir, American defensive capability exceeded intelligence estimates. A single machine gun, employed in a forward position contrary to their standard doctrine, generated casualty rates we associate with prepared defensive works, not hasty field positions." Major Sato's jaw tightened. "You're suggesting our intelligence regarding American tactical employment is inaccurate?" "I'm suggesting, sir, that American forces demonstrate greater tactical flexibility than our planning assumes. They're adapting their doctrine based on field conditions. That single weapon should have been positioned 200 yards behind their main line, according to their manuals. Instead, it was forward, exactly where it would have maximum effect against our assault doctrine." The silence that followed was heavy with implications neither officer could explicitly state. Japanese military culture demanded respect for hierarchy and established procedure. Questioning doctrine meant questioning the judgment of senior officers, ultimately questioning the emperor's divine guidance of military affairs. But reality had a way of making uncomfortable truths unavoidable. "What are your casualties?" Major Sato finally asked. 62 confirmed dead, 15 wounded evacuated, out of 80 soldiers committed to the assault." Yamamoto paused. "Sir, that's 77% casualties for 0 territorial gain. Those numbers are unprecedented in our regiment's history." Major Sato lowered his binoculars. For a moment his official bearing cracked, revealing something more human. "The Americans have more of these weapons. Many more. If they begin employing them as your report suggests." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "If American forces, with their vast industrial capacity and mechanical aptitude, began systematically deploying crew-served weapons in forward positions, Japanese infantry assault doctrine faced obsolescence. The massed banzai charge, the spiritual warfare that Japanese military culture elevated as supreme tactical expression, would become mass suicide against enemies who could generate sustained firepower from individual fighting holes." But acknowledging this meant acknowledging that American pragmatism, the willingness to discard doctrine when field conditions demanded adaptation, represented a tactical advantage that Japanese rigid hierarchical structure couldn't match. It meant admitting that the spiritually weak Americans possessed a form of strength Japanese military philosophy hadn't anticipated. The strength to question authority, to innovate under pressure, to let individual soldiers make tactical decisions that contradicted established procedure. Captain Yamamoto watched Marines moving through their defensive positions, preparing for the next engagement. One soldier, possibly the machine gunner himself, was cleaning the Browning, hands moving with practiced efficiency that spoke of deep mechanical understanding. That soldier had killed 62 Japanese soldiers in 15 minutes, not through spiritual superiority or divine guidance, but through pragmatic deployment of firepower in a position that doctrine said was wrong, but reality proved was exactly right. "Major," Yamamoto said quietly, "I believe we're fighting an enemy whose tactical culture we fundamentally misunderstand, and that misunderstanding is killing our soldiers." Major Sato didn't respond. He simply turned and walked back toward regimental headquarters, carrying a report that would be minimized, rationalized, and ultimately ignored by commanders who couldn't accept that doctrine written in Tokyo might be wrong when tested against American innovation 7,000 miles from home. December 15, 1945, San Antonio, Texas. The war had been over for 4 months. Tony Castillo walked down Commerce Street wearing a civilian shirt and dungarees, his Marine Corps uniform packed in a trunk in his parents' attic, along with a Purple Heart earned on Iwo Jima and a Silver Star, awarded for actions on Bougainville. The mid-morning sun was warm, the air clean and free of cordite smoke. The city hummed with peacetime energy, car horns, streetcars, vendors calling out in Spanish and English, the sounds of a nation transitioning from war to prosperity. Tony had been home for 6 weeks. The nightmares were less frequent now. The ringing in his ears had diminished to a background hiss. His hands no longer shook when he held his nephew's toy rifle. But certain sounds, a car backfiring, the pneumatic hammer at his uncle's machine shop, still triggered immediate physical reactions. Heart racing, hands reaching for weapons that weren't there, eyes scanning for threats that didn't exist. The official record of November 7, 1943, was preserved in after-action reports filed by 3rd Marine Division and eventually archived at Headquarters Marine Corps in Washington. The engagement at Piva Trail rated 3 paragraphs in divisional history. Enemy force estimated 80 to 100 personnel attacked 2nd Platoon, E Company positions at 05:21 hours. Assault repelled with estimated 60-plus enemy KIA. Friendly casualties, 0. Defensive success attributed to effective employment of crew-served weapons in forward positions, contrary to then-current doctrine. That dry official language concealed a transformation that rippled through Marine Corps tactical training for the next decade. Within 3 months of the Bougainville engagement, revised doctrine explicitly authorized machine gun employment in forward defensive positions when tactical situation warrants. By mid-1944, Marine Corps schools at Quantico, Virginia, incorporated case studies of the Piva Trail engagement into weapons employment curriculum. The lesson was explicit. Doctrine provides framework, but combat demands adaptation. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, the battalion commander who'd emphasized individual rifleman doctrine in peacetime briefings, never publicly acknowledged error. But in private correspondence with Marine Corps Development Center, dated March 1944 and declassified in 1968, he wrote, "Recent combat experience demonstrates that crew-served weapons, when employed by Marines demonstrating initiative and mechanical proficiency, provide defensive capability exceeding doctrinal predictions. Recommend revision of employment doctrine to reflect field realities." That bureaucratic language represented something profound, institutional acknowledgement that individual soldiers' tactical judgment could supersede officers' pre-planned doctrine. It was a very American concept: trust in individual competence, respect for field experience, willingness to admit that plans made in safety might fail when tested by reality. The British and Soviet armies, with their more rigid hierarchical structures, took years to reach similar conclusions. The Japanese military never did, continuing to employ banzai charges into 1945, despite mounting evidence of their ineffectiveness against American firepower. The statistical analysis conducted by Marine Corps operational research teams in 1945 quantified what Tony Castillo had proven instinctively: a single M1919A4 Browning machine gun, properly positioned and sustained through adequate ammunition supply, could generate defensive effects equivalent to a reinforced rifle squad. Cost analysis showed the positioning machine guns forward increased vulnerability to counterfire, but decreased overall casualties by preventing enemy breakthrough. The mathematics were stark. Accepting 10% higher machine gun crew casualties prevented 400% higher casualties across the defensive sector, but numbers didn't capture the human dimension. 62 Japanese soldiers died because Tony Castillo decided the doctrine was wrong. 40 Marines in 2nd Platoon survived for the same reason. And somewhere in Japan, 62 families received official notifications that their sons or husbands had died honorably in combat, never knowing that those deaths resulted from their military leadership's refusal to adapt doctrine to reality. Tony's personal aftermath was less dramatic than official histories suggested. He'd been rotated stateside in July 1944 after Guam, having accumulated 18 months of combat service. He'd missed Iwo Jima's initial assault, but was recalled for occupation duty, where a sniper round through his left shoulder earned the Purple Heart and a medical discharge. His Silver Star citation was written by Captain Harrison, who'd taken command after the company commander was killed on Guam. Harrison's draft citation was explicit. Private First Class Castillo's initiative in deploying crew-served weapons, contrary to established doctrine, directly resulted in preservation of defensive integrity and prevented catastrophic casualties. Some Pentagon staff officer, uncomfortable with explicitly endorsing doctrinal violation, had edited it to Private First Class Castillo's exceptional initiative in employment of defensive weapons resulted in successful defeat of numerically superior enemy force. The meaning was preserved, but the uncomfortable truth was softened. Now, walking through San Antonio in December 1945, Tony Castillo was 24 years old, unemployed, living with his parents, and trying to figure out what civilian life meant. His uncle had offered him work at the machine shop. The GI Bill would pay for college if he wanted engineering school. But mostly, Tony was trying to understand how to live in a world where decisions didn't immediately result in people living or dying. At 11:30 hours, he walked into the Bexar County Veterans Administration office. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, reviewed his discharge papers and medical records. Mr. Castillo, your service record is quite impressive. Silver Star, Purple Heart, 3 campaign stars. Have you given thought to career counseling? Many veterans with your leadership experience qualify for management training programs. Leadership experience? Tony almost laughed. He'd been a PFC for his entire service, never promoted above private first class, never commanded anyone. But he'd made decisions that saved 40 lives and took 62, had proven that individual initiative mattered more than rank insignia, had demonstrated that questioning authority was sometimes the most patriotic thing a soldier could do. Ma'am, I was a machine gunner. I'm not sure that qualifies as management experience. He smiled. Mr. Castillo, according to these after-action reports, you demonstrated tactical judgment that contradicted officer-level planning and prevented a military disaster. That sounds like management experience to me. The conversation continued. Routine bureaucratic processing of another returning veteran among millions. But it captured something essential about American military culture in 1945. The recognition that individual competence, regardless of rank, had won the war. The massive production capacity of Detroit's factories and California's shipyards had provided material advantage. But advantage meant nothing without soldiers willing to use it innovatively, to question doctrine when doctrine failed reality, to trust their own judgment even when colonels and majors said otherwise. By 1950, the Browning M1994 was being phased out, replaced by lighter, more portable designs. But its legacy at Piva Trail influenced Marine Corps tactical thinking for decades. The lesson wasn't about the weapon itself. It was about empowering individual Marines to make tactical decisions, about trusting field experience over peacetime theory, about recognizing that American military strength came not from rigid doctrine, but from flexible adaptation. Tony Castillo never spoke publicly about November 7, 1943. When his nephews asked about the war years later, he'd say only, "I did my job. A lot of good men did more." But in 1978, when Marine Corps Gazette published a retrospective on Pacific War small unit actions, they interviewed him for an article titled Initiative at Piva Trail. The interviewer asked what he'd been thinking when he moved the Browning forward against orders. Tony had thought for a long moment before answering. "I was thinking that officers make plans based on doctrine, But battles are won by kids from Texas and Ohio and California who understand that sometimes you got to break the rules to do the right thing. That's always been America's strength. We trust the guy doing the work, not just the guy giving orders. That quote became a case study at Marine Corps University, illustrating the doctrinal principle that emerged from World War II. Mission-type orders that provide objective and intent, but trust subordinate initiative for execution. It was the antithesis of Japanese rigid hierarchical command, the opposite of Soviet centralized control. It was distinctly essentially American, faith that individual competence, properly equipped and trained, would find solutions that no pre-war planning could anticipate. Tony Castillo died in 1992, aged 71. Having worked 38 years at his uncle's machine shop, raised 4 children, and lived a life of profound ordinariness, marked by one extraordinary morning when he'd proven that doctrine was just theory until tested by a PFC from San Antonio, who understood machines better than the colonels understood war. The unsung heroes who shaped history with courage and quick thinking deserve to be remembered. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who appreciates real American grit. Drop a comment telling us which WW2 story you'd like to hear next. There are thousands more like Tony's waiting to be told. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these incredible true stories of valor.